I got two really interesting stories. Hopefully, you guys think so too today. The lottery and a good man is hard to find. So, I figure we'll start off with the lottery because that is one of my favorite stories of all time. Fun fact about the author, Shirley Jackson. One, if you ever saw Haunting of Hill House on Netflix, that's also based on one of her stories. And two, this story was actually banned in a bunch of countries. Not that long, but it was banned for a little while. And the reason why it was banned is kind of stupid, actually. It's not because of the ending, which is like super and supremely violent. It was actually banned because a woman wrote it, and people couldn't deal with or wrap their minds around the fact that a woman came up with such an disturbing, violent story and disturbing, violent ending. Like I said, it wasn't banned for super long. I know it was banned in England. I'm not totally sure if it was banned in the United States, but it absolutely was banned for a little while. So, that being said, there are a couple things I want to talk about in this story. And we're going to actually get into this story in a little more depth than we have with their other stories. We're going to talk about symbolism in the story. We're going to talk about foreshadowing, and I think this story is a masterclass in foreshadowing. Sneak preview, the ending probably took a bunch of people by surprise, but as we'll see, there's actually hints of the ending right from the first paragraph, and you don't pick up on them the first time through because Shirley Jackson is a master of psychology and knows what sort of assumptions you'll make and what your mental default position is, and she manipulates you right throughout the story. So if you wanted to go back and read the story a second time, you'll pick up on the foreshadowing this time because you know the ending. But when you don't know the ending, you just don't pick up on them. And that actually starts from the title. Before I get into that, at the end of the story, remember how we talked about a short story doesn't necessarily always have to have a message or a moral? Well, this story has at least three messages or three morals to it, and we'll cover those two as we go. And that manipulation and that moral starts from the not even the first paragraph, starts from the title, the lottery. And when you think of lottery, when most people think of the word lottery, you think things like Powerball or scratch-offs or, you could win money or a car or a vacation. Point being, you think the lottery is a good thing. When you're studying literature or just writing, there are these two things called connotation and denotation. Denotation is the exact dictionary definition of a word. Connotation is all the things a word calls to mind or you associate with or what it makes you think about. And on some level, connotation is different for each person. But what Shirley Jackson is doing is banking on the fact that you're going to go with the connotation of lottery that you associated with good things like winning money, cash, prizes, cars, like I said. Lottery doesn't have to be good. The denotation of the word lottery, the exact dictionary definition, is a random drawing of chance. It doesn't have to be a good thing. Which brings me to my first moral or point of the story. Are there any lotteries that you don't want to win? Are there any lotteries that you don't want to be called for? And some of you guys mentioned World War II in your discussion posts, and my reply to that was, yeah, that's part of it. But this story was written on the cusp of another war, the Korean War. And if you're thinking about wars, are there any lotteries that you don't want to win? Remember, this story at the end of the day is about a person being picked by chance and being sent off to die for no reason, for a reason you might not believe in. Just pick the chance and being sent off to die. Is there anything like that we don't have anymore, but we used to? That's associated with war? If you said the draft, then you would be absolutely right. So maybe on some level, this story is an anti-war story. You get picked at random, you get sent off to die for the good of the town, for the good of the country. Maybe it's an anti-war story. So I'm going to take you through a couple. We're going to go slow through the beginning of the story because there's a lot to unpack there. Let me read the first sentence to you. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. That's a beautiful, wonderful, tranquil, calm, peaceful opening. Now compare that to the end of the story, which is basically an explosion of violence, and ask yourself, why do you think Shirley Jackson starts her story with a calm and peaceful setting? Well, the answer is to mess with your emotions, to mess with your expectations. It's a beautiful, calm summer day. Nothing bad could possibly happen on a beautiful, calm summer day. We love summer. We like summer. There's no school. Well, not for us. We're technically taking an online class. But it's the time you hang out, the time you're outside. You enjoy summer. You like summer. Nothing bad's going to happen. Shirley Jackson's betting on the fact that you'll assume that, or you'll make that connection with a nice summer day. And because you do that, the ending of the story hits you that much harder. Let's keep reading a little more. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock in some towns. There were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 2nd. But in this village, where there are only about 300 people, the whole lottery took less than 2 hours. I'm going to pause there. Here's a question you might not have asked yourself. When does this story take place? Like, what time period? Is it modern day, or for her, 1948? Is it colonial times? Is it medieval times? Is it caveman times? Well, we can kind of eliminate caveman times. We can kind of eliminate medieval times. No, but this story, she doesn't really pinpoint it in the exact place. You have a bank and post office, which makes it seem pretty modern, but that could be 1800s, 1900s. So ask yourself this, why does she not pin the story down to a particular specific time period? And I think the answer to that is, if you root a story in a particular time and place, maybe if you're trying to get a moral across or a message across, if you fix and lock your story into a specific moment in time, it becomes unrelatable to people who read it 20 years, 40 years, 50 years, 70 years, 100 years down the road. By leaving the setting vague enough to be relatable for people in the future, Jackson sort of ensures that her message, her morals, are going to resonate down the road. We already mentioned one of those morals, anti-draft story. Here comes another one of those moral or messages, and to me this is the most disturbing line in the story. The whole lottery took less than 2 hours, so it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. That should chill. That should be terrifying. Basically, what she's saying is these people want to get the killing over with so they could go home, swing by Burger King or Taco Bell, and get something to eat. Well, they're killing somebody. They're brutally murdering somebody. Eating should be the last thing on your mind. So the question becomes, how are they so chill with it? How are they so cool with it? And this brings us to something a bunch of you guys mentioned in your discussion post, and the second moral message or takeaway from the story, desensitization to violence. Basically, if you are surrounded by violence all the time, and even the kids are surrounded by the violence, they are fair game in the lottery and they participate in the execution. And if you grow up with something like that being the norm, it doesn't faze you. It doesn't bother you. I guess the best example that Shirley Jackson didn't have in mind, because it predates her, but the most current example of desensitization to violence is, if you've ever heard of the violent video games causes violent people argument. The idea there is, if you grow up playing like first-person shooters where you can splatter zombie brains and kill people left and right, you sort of become accustomed, or violence doesn't faze you, and it becomes easier to commit an act of violence. I'm not sure if I believe that with respect to video games, and not just because I'm a huge video game fan. I actually saw a documentary once where they took a kid, I think he was 10 or 11, who played a ton of first-person shooter video games, and they took him, not like kidnapped him, his mom was there, they took him to a gun range, and they gave him a gun, and they said, shoot as many times as you want. He got one shot off, and he ran screaming to his mom, because there are a couple things first-person shooter games don't prepare you for. They don't prepare you for the kickback of a gun. They don't prepare you for the loud boom of a gun. And they don't prepare you for the smell of burning sulfur. This kid got one shot off. And in my mind, that kind of shows that you can play all the violent video games you want. It's not the same thing. That's neither here nor there. Like I said, the kids aren't shielded from the violence. The kids participate in the violence. And when you grow up surrounded by this violence, you get to the point where you can kind of like back burner the fact that you're killing somebody because you want to get done in time for lunch. Here is what, in my mind, is the second most chilling line in the story. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and other boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. First time too you're reading that, you're like, it's not a big deal, kids. Kids, this is what kids do. They collect rocks, they skip stones. It's normal for kids to do. Now, after you've read the story already, you know that they are collecting the execution weapons. And here's the scary part. They selected the smoothest and roundest stones. First time through, you're probably assuming they just want to skip rocks across the water. But here's the real reason they selected the smoothest and roundest stones. They take the longest time to kill you. They do the maximum internal damage, blunt force trauma, without cutting and gashing and leaving open wounds. Because if you have an open wound, you can bleed out pretty quickly. But the smoothest and roundest stones are going to damage your internal organs, and they are going for maximum injury and maximum pain. You got a couple other real quick examples of her messing with your expectations. They tell you that people were joking quietly and smiling rather than laughing, which talks about like attention. If you think this is a lottery that people actually want to win, why are people like having this awkward tension? Because each of them wants to win, which means they are secretly rooting for everybody else to lose. In reality, why is there awkward tension? Because one of them is going to die, and you're hoping that it's not going to be you, which by extension means you're hoping somebody else is going to die. You have to call the kids 4 or 5 times. First time through, you're reading that, you're like, that's what kids do. Try to get a kid to come the first time you call them. It's like herding kittens. It's not going to happen. Now that you know the ending, these kids are probably freaked out that they're going to see somebody stoned to death and they have to participate in it. Now, we are moving to the symbolism portion of our discussion. Some of the characters have names. First person you have is Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no wife and his child was a scold. Again, Summers, and this time she's making it a little bit clearer. The name Summers you associate with positivity, happiness, sunshine, light, green grass, all that stuff. The irony is Mr. Summers is the guy who's going to call you to death. Like, he's the guy who's going to essentially, like, seal your fate to die. And there are some hints of that in his description. First, he runs the coal business, and, as you know from Santa, coal is not something you want to receive in your stocking. And here's a next level interpretation of the story. You find out that his wife was a scold, which basically means really, really mean, and that he has no kids. I'm not saying this is 100% clear, I'm not saying this is 100% true, but sometimes you can read between the lines of a story. Well, why would his wife be mean and he has no kids? Is there any way you can connect those two facts? Well, I've always read it or interpreted it as, remember, kids are not exempt from being called in the lottery. Maybe he did have a kid. And maybe the kid's name was called. And as the lottery master, maybe he could have done something about it. Maybe he could have rigged it. Maybe he could have fixed it. But he didn't. And that's why his wife is a scold. Maybe. The other guy with the name is Mr. Graves, and there are 2 things going on with that name. If you go to a dictionary, there are usually like 2 or 3 definitions of a word, the primary definition and the secondary definition. Well, one definition of graves is like a place where you put a dead body, which makes sense that this guy, who is like the co-chair of the lottery, has the name Graves, because if he calls you, you're going to end up in a grave. The other definition of grave is something that is grim and serious, and I think that's appropriate to him because obviously this is a grim and serious situation. Then you have the box. The box is black, and you pull a name out of it. Hopefully, it's sort of obvious that this black box symbolizes death. But there are other ways it's symbolic of death too. Did you pick up on what happens to the box the other 360 some odd days of the year? They store it in random out-of-the-way places, on the back shelf in a store, under a barn. Well, why do you think they do that? Because they don't want to think about it. They don't want to think about the lottery, and they don't want to think about death. And you can connect this back to Mask of the Red Death a little bit, in that people don't like thinking about death. People don't like talking about death. Like I said, use the word funeral home, euthanize, put to sleep, all these verbal gymnastics to get out of talking about death. And that's when death intrudes randomly. This, death is coming once a year on that same date, June 27th. So for the rest of the year, it makes sense that you don't want to think about it. You don't want to acknowledge it. And this is a next level interpretation. But if we'll talk about the history of the lottery in a little bit, but you find out that there used to be hand gestures and chanting. The names they pulled out used to be on pieces of wood. Now they're on pieces of paper. They got rid of all that, and the box itself is made out of bits and pieces or relics of the old box. There are parts of the old box incorporated into the new box. And if you take that and you run with it, the box, the black box of death, is symbolic of the lottery itself, the tradition. They don't use the paper and they don't use the wood anymore. They use paper. They don't use the hand gestures and the chants anymore. They sure as hell use the stoning to death anymore. So just like the lottery itself is sort of containing parts of the old tradition or the original lottery, the box itself contains parts of the original box or parts of the original tradition. If you don't get that, don't worry. That's kind of a little bit of a next level interpretation, but I figured I'd throw it out there. So if you had to pick a main character of the story, it would probably be Tessie. And there's some foreshadowing going on with Tessie too, but I'm going to talk about that in a second. I'm going to read to you the paragraph where Tessie is introduced. Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders, and slid into place in the black of the crowd. Clean forgot what day it was, she said to Mrs. Delacroix, who stood next to her, and they both laughed softly. Thought my old man was out back stacking wood, Mrs. Hutchinson went on, and then I looked out the window and the kids was gone, and then I remembered it was 27th and came a-running. She's the only character you maybe develop any attachment for. There's something else about her, too. The words I kind of highlighted there, hurriedly, thrown, slid, running. There is the most physical motion associated with Tessie than there is with any other character, which means she's the most active, vibrant, and alive character in the story. And the grand irony is they ended up killing the most active and alive character. I'm going to go back to my little foreshadowing thing. Her good friend, Mrs. Delacroix, and we'll talk about how good a friend she is at the end, she tapped Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a farewell. When you're first reading it, you think farewell, see you later. Really, it means farewell, never going to see you again. Mrs. Delacroix later says, thought you were going to have to get on without you, Tessie, meaning she thought they were going to have to do the lottery without her, but now that you know the ending, that sort of foreshadows the ending, and that we're going to have to get on with you cosmically for the rest of the time. So, one of the questions I like to ask is, when do you realize this is a lottery you don't need to win? And most people will tell you when Tessie starts objecting. Because honestly, if I won the lottery, no, it's not fair, no, you have to do it again, would not be the words out of my mouth. I'd be like, screw you, you're cool, awesome, peace, I'm out of here, done. But Tessie starts complaining. And that's when most people realize that something's off. And just to recap, this is how the lottery happens. Basically, there are two rounds. First round, your family name gets drawn out. And if your family name gets drawn out, you move to the second round of the lottery where all your family comes up to draw. If you pick out a piece of paper with a black dot on it, you're done. You're dead. Here's how messed up Tessie is. I don't know if you picked up on this. If a daughter gets married, she draws with the husband's family. Tessie tries to get her daughter to draw with her family. Why? Well, the more people there are in the lottery, less of a chance you have of dying. So Tessie is basically not above throwing her own daughter under the bus to save her own self. That doesn't happen. The family goes up to draw. And here's something else that's kind of messed up. See if I can find it real fast. Basically, the two little kids, when they draw, they pull out a white piece of paper. That means they're not going to die. And they celebrate and high five, which on some level I get that, you're not going to die, but think about the other half. They're not going to die. Someone in their family is, and they're celebrating like they just caught a touchdown in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl. So, like I said, this kind of tweaks you. Having this lottery, the mom's willing to throw one of the kids under the bus, and these two kids are celebrating that they're not going to die, but also, by extension, celebrating that somebody else is going to die. And, of course, Tessie gets the black dot, and she's going to get executed. And she gets stoned to death, and not in the fun way. And the little kids, her kids, they even throw pebbles at their mom, get starter kit to stoning somebody to death. And remember her best friend, Mrs. Delacroix? Anyone remember which stone she throws at her? The biggest, heaviest, densest stone. Two ways to look at that. One, Mrs. Delacroix isn't being a very good friend and is trying to hurt Tessie. The other way of looking at that is she is actually being a good friend, in that she's throwing a stone at her that will kill her quickly so she doesn't have to suffer. So we talked about two of the messages of this story. Anti-draft story, anti-war story, desensitization of violence. And the third, and I think the most important, and this was what the whole discussion question was about, why do they do this? Why do they hold the lottery? And some people said that it was for good crops. Maybe back originally. I mean, there's like, it's held on around the summer solstice. Mr. Old Man Warner has that thing about lottery in June, good crops soon or something. Let's be honest, they advanced past that. They have post offices and banks. They're not the type of civilization that believes in sacrificing for a crop. So why do they do it? For no other reason than that is what's always been done. It is tradition. And like I said in a bunch of people's discussion responses, that's not the best or most valid reason to do something. But it happens all the time. I'll give you some, granted these aren't horrible, violent examples, but it happens all the time. Why do you shake, or did we used to, we're not allowed to anymore, why did we used to shake people's hands when we meet them? It's to see if you have a weapon up their sleeve. When you move a hand up and down, if you have a knife or something up your sleeve, it'll come out. Any of you girls have a Sweet 16 or a quinceañera? Why did you do that? Well, because back in the day, that meant you were of marrying age, and your dad could swap you for a bunch of goats, chickens, eggs, cows, or something like that. And Sweet 16 or quinceañera was your debut on the market. Halloween. Why do we celebrate Halloween? Well, because on All Hallows Eve, the veil between this world and the next world was at its thinnest, and supposedly all these spirits and demons would come screaming through, and to appease them, you'd either have to leave food on your doorstep for them or leave a fire burning to scare them off. Well, those demons, ghouls, and monsters have become trick-or-treaters. The food you leave out has become trick-or-treating, giving out candy, and the burning fires on your front porch have become jack-o'-lanterns. But we don't know this. We don't. If you ever get married, best man. Why do you have a best man? Well, the technical name, it used to be best swordsman, which meant if stuff went down at your wedding, he could defend the bride and the groom. If anyone ever had a bachelor party, then the name for a bachelor party is a stag party, because what the groom and his best man and his party used to do the night before the wedding is go out and hunt a stag to be eaten at the wedding. Again, these are all traditions that we do, we follow, we do them, but we don't really know why. And really, in the grand scheme of things, are the examples I gave you the worst thing in the world? No, they don't end in a violent, bloody stoning. Well, some bachelor parties do, but that's neither here nor there. They don't end in a violent, bloody stoning, but at its worst, following something just because that's the way it's done, and following stuff because that's the way we've always done it, is not the best reason for doing something in the world. So, if there's a message to the story, a moral of the story, like I said, there are probably three, but the biggest, most important one, and take this, if you take anything away from this class, take this away. Question stuff. Question authority. Don't do stuff just because. Find out why you're doing something, and if you're not cool with something, challenge it. Fight it. Okay, descending from my soapbox now, and we will move to A Good Man Is Hard to Find.